Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamada stepped off the transport truck at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, on a sweltering afternoon in June 1943, expecting to face the degradation and brutality the Japanese military doctrine taught awaited captured soldiers. Instead, he found himself staring at what looked like a small, well-organized city that had materialized in the American countryside. Paved roads stretched in neat geometric patterns between rows of identical wooden barracks. Electric lights hung from proper poles, not improvised from scavenged materials as he had grown accustomed to seeing in Japanese military installations. Water flowed freely from multiple spigots, and American soldiers moved with a casual efficiency that suggested abundant resources rather than careful conservation of every supply. The intake process itself defied everything Yamada had been taught about American character and capability. A medical officer examined him with instruments that gleamed like polished silver, using bandages that came in sealed packages and medicines stored in glass bottles with printed labels. The abundance of medical supplies alone staggered him. In his 3 years of service with the Imperial Japanese Navy, he had watched field hospitals run desperately short of basic necessities, while American forces, it now appeared, equipped even their prison facilities with surgical quality equipment. The American sergeant processing his paperwork worked from forms printed on clean white paper, using multiple carbon copies to create identical records. Yamada watched, fascinated, as the man casually discarded sheets that contained minor errors, simply pulling fresh forms from what appeared to be an inexhaustible supply. Such waste would have been unthinkable in Japanese military administration, where every scrap of paper was precious and reused until it literally fell apart. His assigned barracks contained amenities that seemed almost luxurious by Japanese military standards. Individual bunks with clean mattresses and fresh linens, footlockers for personal belongings, windows with actual glass panes, not the oiled paper or wooden shutters he knew from Japanese facilities. The building itself was constructed with precision and attention to detail that spoke of abundant materials and skilled labor, not the hasty improvisation that characterized much of Japan's wartime construction. But perhaps most shocking was the casual attitude of the American guards themselves. They chewed gum openly, smoked cigarettes without apparent concern for conserving tobacco, and spoke to prisoners with a matter-of-fact politeness that suggested treating enemy captives well was simply standard procedure rather than special consideration. Their uniforms were clean, properly fitted, and showed no signs of the patching and repair that marked Japanese military clothing by 1943. As evening approached and Yamada was led to the mess hall for his first meal in American custody, he realized that everything he had been told about American military weakness and inefficiency was not just wrong, but catastrophically so. This wasn't a nation struggling to maintain basic military operations. This was a society that had applied industrial-scale organization and abundant resources to every aspect of warfare, including the care and housing of enemy prisoners. The implications were staggering, and they would only become more apparent when he saw what the Americans considered a standard meal. Corporal Takeshi Sato stared at the metal tray placed before him in the mess hall of Camp Livingston, Louisiana, on a humid morning in July 1943. The American guard had announced it was breakfast, but nothing on the tray resembled any morning meal Sato had ever encountered. A hamburger, the guard had called it, though Sato had no context for understanding what that word meant. Beside it lay golden strips of what he would later learn were called French fries, still glistening with oil and salt. A red and white bottle sat sweating condensation in the Louisiana heat, containing a dark liquid that sparkled like liquid obsidian. Sato lifted the hamburger with both hands, studying its construction with the analytical mind of a former engineering student. The bottom bun was soft beyond anything in his experience with bread, yielding like a sponge beneath his fingers. The meat patty was perfectly round, uniform in thickness, with grill marks that formed identical patterns across its surface. This wasn't meat carved from an animal and cooked over a fire. This was meat that had been processed, formed, and prepared according to some industrial standard that prioritized consistency over traditional cooking methods. The slice of cheese defied his understanding of dairy products entirely. It was bright yellow, perfectly rectangular, and had a texture that seemed more like manufactured plastic than anything that had ever come from a cow. When he bit into the assembled sandwich, the flavors hit his palate in waves of salt, fat, and sweetness that overwhelmed his senses. Japanese cuisine, refined over centuries, emphasized subtle flavors and seasonal ingredients. This American creation delivered concentrated satisfaction with all the subtlety of a artillery barrage. Private Ichiro Suzuki, sitting across from Sato, had picked up one of the golden strips and was examining it with scientific curiosity. The French fry was cut to precise dimensions, fried to a consistent golden brown, and dusted with salt in measured quantities. When he bit into it, the contrast between the crispy exterior and fluffy interior created a textural experience unlike anything in traditional Japanese cooking. These weren't vegetables prepared with care and attention to natural flavors. These were potatoes transformed through industrial processes into something designed purely for immediate gratification. But it was the Coca-Cola that truly challenged their understanding of what constituted food or drink. Suzuki opened the bottle, and the dark liquid inside released a sharp hissing sound, followed by bubbles that rose continuously to the surface. The smell was sweet and medicinal, unlike any beverage either man had encountered. Sato took a cautious sip and felt the carbonation explode across his tongue, while sugar flooded his system with an intensity that made his head spin. This wasn't tea, which provided gentle stimulation and subtle flavors. This wasn't sake, which offered warmth and relaxation. This was liquid energy, designed to deliver maximum impact with maximum efficiency. Around them in the mess hall, dozens of other Japanese prisoners were having similar encounters with American fast food. Some refused to touch the strange offerings, convinced that the abundance was either poisoned or part of some elaborate psychological warfare campaign. Others approached the food with the cautious curiosity of scientists encountering alien specimens. A few, driven by hunger that had been their constant companion for months, ate eagerly while trying to process what these foods suggested about American society. Sergeant Kenji Nakamura, captured during the fighting on New Georgia, found himself calculating the resources represented by a single meal. The hamburger required beef, which meant cattle, which meant vast pasture lands and feed production. The cheese suggested dairy operations on an industrial scale. The French fries demanded potatoes, cooking oil, and energy for frying. The Coca-Cola represented the most complex manufacturing process of all, requiring sugar, flavorings, carbonation, bottling plants, and distribution networks that could deliver identical products across an entire continent. As Nakamura worked through these calculations, a disturbing realization began to take shape. If this was how America fed its prisoners, men who represented the enemy and deserved no particular consideration, what did that suggest about American productive capacity? If they could afford to manufacture soft drinks and distribute them to remote prison camps, what did that reveal about their ability to supply armies fighting across multiple theaters of war? If they treated hamburgers and French fries as standard fare rather than luxury items, what did that indicate about the resource base supporting their entire war effort? The questions multiplied faster than the answers as the prisoners encountered food that represented not just sustenance, but symbols of a completely different approach to production, consumption, and the relationship between society and abundance. These weren't just meals, they were glimpses into a civilization that had learned to industrialize pleasure itself. Private Noboru Ishida refused to touch the hamburger on his tray for 3 full days. Captured during the brutal fighting on Bougainville in November 1943, Ishida had been trained as a communications specialist, and his analytical mind approached every situation as a problem to be decoded. The generous treatment at Camp Forest in Tennessee struck him as far too convenient, too perfectly calculated to be mere coincidence. There had to be a hidden purpose, a secret strategy behind American hospitality that he was meant to uncover and report when the opportunity arose. He watched the guards carefully, noting how they moved through the mess hall, how they interacted with prisoners, how they disposed of the seemingly endless supply of food that arrived daily by truck. Everything suggested deliberate psychological manipulation. The Americans were clearly trying to soften Japanese resistance through comfort, to make prisoners forget their loyalty to the emperor by seducing them with abundance. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola weren't food, they were weapons in a campaign designed to corrupt Japanese fighting spirit. Ishida began keeping detailed mental notes of everything he observed, treating the prison camp as an intelligence gathering operation that might someday provide valuable information for Japanese military commanders. He memorized the schedules of food deliveries, noting that trucks arrived with fresh supplies every morning at precisely 8:30. He cataloged the types and quantities of food being served, calculating that each prisoner received more calories per day than many Japanese soldiers in active combat zones. He observed that American guards ate the same food as prisoners, suggesting that this level of abundance was simply normal for American society rather than special treatment designed to influence enemy captives. The more intelligence Ishida gathered, the more disturbing his conclusions became. If the Americans could afford to feed prisoners this well, if they could maintain prison camps that operated with greater efficiency than many Japanese military bases, if they could distribute luxury items like carbonated soft drinks to remote facilities without apparent strain on their supply systems, then Japan was fighting an enemy whose resource base exceeded anything Japanese planners had imagined. Sergeant Yoshio Tanaka, bunking next to Ishida, had developed his own theory about American generosity. The food was clearly drugged, designed to make prisoners docile and compliant. The medical examinations were actually experiments, testing the effects of American chemical weapons on Japanese subjects. The recreational activities, movies, and sports equipment were psychological conditioning designed to make prisoners prefer American culture to their own. Everything about camp life was carefully orchestrated to break down Japanese identity and replace it with American values. For weeks, Tanaka refused to drink anything except water, convinced that the Coca-Cola contained mind-altering substances. He examined every piece of food for signs of tampering, looking for unusual colors, strange odors, or suspicious textures that might indicate the presence of drugs or poison. He watched other prisoners for signs of mental deterioration, expecting to see evidence that American treatment was having its intended effect of weakening Japanese resolve. But gradually, reluctantly, both men began to confront evidence that challenged their theories. The prisoners who ate American food regularly showed no signs of mental impairment or physical deterioration. In fact, many appeared healthier than they had been in months, gaining weight and recovering from injuries and illnesses that had plagued them during their final months of combat. The guards displayed none of the calculated manipulation that psychological warfare would require. Instead, they seemed genuinely surprised when prisoners refused food or expressed suspicion about American motives. Most troubling of all was the casual waste that Ishida observed daily. Guards would throw away half-eaten sandwiches, pour out unwanted coffee, discard damaged packaging without a second thought. If the food was precious enough to be used as a weapon of psychological warfare, why would Americans waste it so carelessly? If the abundant supplies were part of an elaborate deception, why would guards treat them as so utterly routine and disposable? The breakthrough in understanding came during Ishida's fourth week at Camp Forest, when he overheard a conversation between two American guards discussing their hometown experiences during the Depression. One guard mentioned that even during the worst economic crisis in American history, most families had access to more food variety than Japanese military units received during wartime. The other guard casually mentioned that Coca-Cola cost 5 cents in civilian stores and that hamburgers were standard fare at roadside restaurants across the country. Ishida felt something fundamental shift in his understanding as he processed this information. The abundance he was witnessing wasn't special treatment designed to manipulate prisoners. It wasn't a carefully orchestrated psychological warfare campaign. It was simply normal life in American society, the baseline level of prosperity that ordinary American citizens took for granted even during wartime. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola weren't weapons. They were symbols of an economic system so productive that it could afford to treat luxury items as everyday necessities, even for enemy prisoners of war. Sergeant Masao Taniguchi had been working in the kitchen of Camp McCoy for 6 months when he finally stopped thinking of himself as a prisoner and began to feel like a student. It was December 1943. Snow was falling across the Wisconsin landscape, and Taniguchi was learning to operate an industrial ice cream machine that produced frozen dessert with mechanical precision that would have impressed engineers at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. For weeks after his assignment to kitchen duty, Taniguchi had approached every task with the rigid efficiency he had learned in the Imperial Japanese Army. He followed American instructions precisely, completed assigned duties without question, and maintained the emotional distance appropriate for a captured soldier working under enemy supervision. But gradually, almost against his will, he began to appreciate the elegant solutions that American kitchen technology provided to problems of feeding large numbers of people efficiently. The ice cream machine was a marvel of engineering that fascinated his mechanical mind. Precise temperature controls, automated mixing mechanisms, standardized portions that emerged with clockwork regularity. In Japan, ice cream was a rare luxury available only in major cities and only to those who could afford expensive imported ingredients. Here, it was produced daily in quantities sufficient to serve hundreds of prisoners, with surplus that guards would casually consume or sometimes discard if demand fell short of production. Taniguchi found himself studying every piece of equipment in the camp kitchen with growing admiration for American approaches to mass food production. Industrial mixers that could prepare bread dough for entire companies of men, refrigeration units that maintained precise temperatures automatically, without the constant monitoring and ice replenishment that Japanese systems required, cooking surfaces that heated evenly and consistently, eliminating the hot spots and temperature variations that plagued traditional Japanese military kitchens. But perhaps most impressive was the systematic approach to meal planning and preparation. Every aspect of food service was standardized according to written procedures that ensured consistency regardless of which prisoners or guards were working on any given day. Recipes were measured precisely, cooking times were calculated scientifically, and nutritional requirements were met according to predetermined standards that seemed to treat adequate nutrition as a basic assumption rather than a luxury to be rationed carefully. The American soldiers supervising kitchen operations treated Taniguchi and other Japanese workers with a casual professionalism that initially puzzled him. These weren't the brutal guards he had expected based on Japanese military doctrine about enemy treatment of prisoners. They were skilled technicians who seemed genuinely interested in maintaining efficient food service operations, and they appeared to view Japanese prisoners as additional workforce rather than defeated enemies to be punished or humiliated. Corporal James Sullivan from Detroit had been assigned to oversee kitchen operations, and his approach to managing Japanese workers revealed attitudes about efficiency and cooperation that challenged everything Taniguchi thought he understood about American character. Sullivan demonstrated cooking techniques patiently, answered questions about equipment operation without condescension, and even asked for suggestions when Japanese prisoners identified ways to improve workflow or reduce waste in food preparation. The cultural exchange accelerated when Sullivan learned that Taniguchi had managed food service for an entire Japanese infantry regiment before his capture. Instead of treating this information as dangerous intelligence from an enemy officer, Sullivan began asking detailed questions about Japanese cooking methods, ingredient preparation, and approaches to feeding large numbers of troops under difficult conditions. The conversations revealed that both men shared professional pride in solving logistical challenges, regardless of which army they had served. Through these daily interactions, Taniguchi began to understand that American efficiency wasn't the result of superior resources alone, but also represented a different philosophy about how work should be organized and human capabilities utilized. American systems assumed that individual workers could be trusted with responsibility, that good ideas could come from anyone regardless of rank, and that improving efficiency benefited everyone involved in the operation. The recreational activities available to prisoners provided additional lessons in American approaches to morale and human motivation. Movie screenings twice weekly featured Hollywood productions that showcased American technology, lifestyle, and values with a sophistication that rivaled the most advanced Japanese propaganda, except these films appeared to be created for entertainment rather than indoctrination. Sports equipment was available for organized games that mixed Japanese and American players, creating informal cultural exchanges that would have been impossible under the rigid hierarchy of Japanese military organization. Educational programs offered English language instruction, technical training, and even college-level courses for prisoners interested in continuing their education during captivity. Taniguchi enrolled in a mechanical engineering class taught by an American civilian contractor, where he learned principles of industrial design and mass production that began to explain how American society could generate the abundance he witnessed daily in camp operations. The gradual shift from suspicion to appreciation wasn't universal among the prisoners, but it was widespread enough to create a new social dynamic within the camp. Long-term prisoners began to serve as cultural interpreters for newly arrived captives, explaining American customs and helping newcomers adjust to the routines and expectations of camp life. Some prisoners even began to express concern about returning to Japan, worried that their homeland would not be able to provide the opportunities for learning and growth they had discovered in American captivity. Captain Ichiro Nakamura sat in the camp library at Fort Lewis, Washington, on a gray February morning in 1945, staring at a photograph in Time magazine that showed American aircraft carriers stretching to the horizon. The image represented everything he had come to understand about the fundamental miscalculation that had led Japan into this war. These weren't just ships. They were floating cities, each one equipped with facilities that surpassed many Japanese naval bases on land. The caption mentioned that America was producing these vessels faster than Japan could build destroyers. Nakamura had been a staff officer with the Imperial Japanese Navy before his capture during the Marianas Campaign, and his training in logistics and supply management gave him a unique perspective on what he was witnessing in American captivity. For 18 months, he had been documenting every aspect of camp operations, not as intelligence for future Japanese military use, but as evidence of a truth so overwhelming that it had shattered every assumption he held about modern warfare and national power. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola that had initially seemed like bizarre foreign customs now revealed themselves as symbols of something far more significant. They represented a society that had learned to apply industrial mass production not just to weapons and vehicles, but to every aspect of human comfort and satisfaction. The same assembly line techniques that produced identical aircraft engines also created identical hamburgers. The same distribution networks that delivered ammunition to battlefronts also delivered soft drinks to prison camps thousands of miles from major cities. What haunted Nakamura was the growing realization that Japan had been fighting not just against superior American military technology, but against an entirely different understanding of what constituted national strength. Japanese doctrine emphasized sacrifice, endurance, and the spiritual power that came from accepting hardship. American doctrine appeared to emphasize efficiency, abundance, and the practical power that came from eliminating hardship through superior organization and production capacity. The contrast extended to every aspect of the two societies' approaches to warfare. Japanese soldiers had been taught that suffering built character and that victory would come through superior will and dedication. American soldiers, based on what Nakamura observed in the prison camp guards, seemed to assume that victory would come through superior resources and technology. Japanese military planning focused on maximizing the effectiveness of limited supplies. American military planning appeared to focus on ensuring unlimited supplies were available when needed. The psychological impact of this recognition was devastating for a career military officer who had devoted his life to Japanese concepts of duty and sacrifice. If American abundance represented a form of strength that Japan could never match through spiritual dedication alone, then what did that mean for everything he had believed about honor, service, and the path to national greatness? If Americans could afford to treat their enemies better than Japan treated its own soldiers, then the entire foundation of Japanese military culture required fundamental re-examination. Nakamura's crisis of understanding deepened as he learned more about American society through conversations with guards and educational programs offered to prisoners. The abundance he witnessed wasn't the result of natural advantages like superior geography or climate. It was the product of systematic innovations in organization, technology, and social cooperation that had been developed over decades of peacetime industrial growth. Americans hadn't stumbled upon prosperity. They had engineered it through deliberate choices about how to structure their economy and society. The implications extended far beyond military strategy to questions about the future of Japan itself. If Japan lost this war, as now seemed inevitable given the evidence of American productive superiority, how could Japanese society rebuild and compete in a post-war world dominated by American approaches to efficiency and abundance? Could Japan adopt American methods of mass production and distribution while maintaining its cultural identity and values? Or would defeat require not just military surrender, but cultural transformation as well? These questions became more urgent as news from the Pacific Theater became increasingly dire throughout early 1945. American bombers were ranging freely over Japanese cities, and the prison camp guards spoke openly of imminent invasion of the Japanese home islands. Some prisoners clung to hope that Japan's legendary fighting spirit would somehow prevail against American material advantages. But Nakamura could no longer sustain such illusions after witnessing firsthand the depth and sophistication of American industrial capability. The final revelation came during a conversation with an American civilian contractor who had been hired to teach technical skills to interested prisoners. The man casually mentioned that American factories were already beginning to retool for peacetime production, anticipating the conversion from military equipment to consumer goods that would follow the war's end. This wasn't a nation straining every resource to maintain its war effort. This was a society so confident in its productive capacity that it was already planning for post-war abundance while simultaneously fighting a global conflict on multiple fronts. August 15, 1945, arrived at Camp Shelby with the oppressive heat and humidity that made Mississippi summers almost unbearable. But for Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamada and his fellow prisoners, the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement, broadcast through the camp's public address system in crackling Japanese that seemed to come from another world entirely. The war was over. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. Everything these men had fought for, everything they had believed about their nation's destiny, had ended not in glorious sacrifice, but in simple defeat. The hours following the surrender announcement transformed the atmosphere of American prison camps in ways that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. The rigid psychological barriers that had separated captors from captives began to dissolve as both sides grappled with the reality that former enemies would now need to find new ways of relating to each other. American guards, many of whom had lost friends and family members in the Pacific War, found themselves offering cigarettes and quiet condolences to Japanese prisoners who sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of their country's defeat. Yamada watched in amazement as Sergeant Mike O'Brien from Boston, who had maintained strict professional distance throughout months of guard duty, sat down beside Private Kenji Suzuki and began sharing photographs of his family back home. The conversation was halting, conducted through gestures and the few English words Suzuki had learned during his captivity, but it represented a fundamental shift in how these two men understood their relationship to each other and to the conflict that had brought them together. The camp mess hall became an unlikely center for cultural exchange as guards and prisoners began sharing meals and stories with an openness that military discipline had previously prohibited. American soldiers found themselves learning to use chopsticks while teaching Japanese prisoners the finer points of baseball strategy. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola that had once symbolized an alien culture now served as bridges to mutual understanding, familiar elements in conversations that ranged from homesickness and family concerns to hopes and fears about an uncertain post-war future. Corporal James Mitchell from Iowa, who had been fascinated by Japanese prisoners throughout his guard duty assignment, began organizing informal English lessons that quickly evolved into broader discussions about cultural differences and similarities between American and Japanese society. Mitchell discovered that many prisoners were equally curious about American life and had been quietly observing American customs with the same intensity that Americans had been studying Japanese behavior. The educational programs that had been available to interested prisoners now took on new significance as former enemies began preparing for a post-war world where cooperation, rather than conflict, might define their relationship. Technical training sessions became collaborative workshops where Japanese precision and attention to detail combined with American approaches to efficiency and mass production. Some prisoners who had initially resisted American teaching methods now embraced them as potential keys to understanding how Japan might rebuild and modernize after defeat. Private Noboru Ishida, who had spent months analyzing American abundance as potential military intelligence, now found himself helping recently captured Japanese soldiers understand the realities of American society that would likely influence Japan's post-war development. The suspicion and resistance that had characterized his early months of captivity gave way to a pragmatic recognition that Japan would need to learn from American methods if it hoped to recover and compete in a post-war world dominated by American power. But perhaps most remarkably, many prisoners began expressing reluctance about the prospect of repatriation to Japan. The devastation of Japanese cities, the collapse of Japanese industry, and the uncertain political future of their homeland contrasted sharply with the stability and prosperity they had witnessed in American prison camps. Some prisoners worried that the skills and perspectives they had developed during captivity would be viewed with suspicion by Japanese authorities who might see any appreciation for American methods as evidence of disloyalty or corruption. The bonds formed between guards and prisoners during these final months of captivity would prove to have lasting significance far beyond the immediate circumstances of their wartime encounter. Many American soldiers and Japanese prisoners maintained correspondence after the war, sharing news about family developments, career changes, and the evolving relationship between their two countries. These personal connections became informal channels for cultural exchange that helped lay the groundwork for the post-war alliance that would transform former enemies into close partners. Kenji Watanabe stood at the rail of the repatriation ship USS General Meigs as it entered Tokyo Bay in December 1945, clutching a small glass bottle that had once contained Coca-Cola. The bottle was empty now, but he had saved it throughout the long months of captivity as a tangible reminder of everything he had learned about American society and his own country's place in the modern world. Around him, hundreds of other former prisoners watched in silence as the devastated landscape of their homeland came into view for the first time since their capture. The contrast was heartbreaking and illuminating in equal measure. Where American prison camps had buzzed with activity, efficiency, and abundance, the Japan they were returning to lay in ruins. Cities reduced to ash and rubble, harbors clogged with the hulks of sunken ships, an industrial infrastructure that had once seemed formidable now revealed as primitive compared to the productive capacity they had witnessed across the Pacific. But these men carried within them more than memories of defeat and devastation. They possessed knowledge that would help reshape their homeland according to principles they had first encountered as prisoners of war. The Hamburgers and Coca-Cola that had once shocked them with their strangeness would become symbols not of foreign occupation, but of the prosperity and efficiency that Japan could achieve by learning from its former enemies. In the decades that followed, many former prisoners became bridges between cultures. Entrepreneurs who established businesses based on American principles of mass production and standardization, educators who taught new generations about the importance of efficiency and abundance, diplomats who helped forge the alliance that would transform Japan into one of the world's most prosperous nations. Today, visitors to Tokyo can find McDonald's restaurants and Coca-Cola on virtually every street corner, symbols of a Japan that learned to combine its own values with lessons first absorbed in American prison camps, creating a new model of prosperity that other nations would study and emulate.